Good evening, Moscow. Um, we're Andrew McCarthy and Connor Matherne.
Hi, it's Connor Matherne here.
We're the guys that put together a moon photo that we'd love to talk about and get into how moon photography works and why our image of the moon may look different than your image of the moon if you ever tried to capture one yourself. Um, So to start, again, my name is Andrew McCarthy, and I'm a professional astrophotographer. I do this full time from my backyard. I don't do it for any agency. I simply do it for myself and for all of you. I take photos of things like nebulas, galaxies, planets, our sun, and of course our moon. And I do them at a level most people didn't think was possible by amateurs like myself. And I can get into a little bit about how it works and how potentially you could do the same thing.
So, hello everyone. Again, thank you for joining us. I'm Connor Matherne. Unlike Andrew, I don't actually do photography full time, but I am a scientist full time, right? So I used to actually work with NASA. I worked with them on the Mars Perseverance mission, which is our newest rover that we sent over to Mars. I actually worked on determining the landing site for that, right? So, looking at where on Mars is the most ideal conditions geologically, like what would tell us the most about, the red planet and its past. So what would be the most beneficial area to land in? Outside of that, I also continue to do astrophotography on the side. My main focus, though, is deep space. I do a lot of work with nebulas and galaxies, although I have been known on occasion to take a few photos of the moon, especially when Andrew is inspiring me to do such. Um, but outside of photography, I can use those skills in my day to day life, right? With the work I do. I just recently captured a photo using radio waves of the nearby Centaurus A galaxy, which is a very nearby or barred spiral galaxy over. Only visible from the southern hemisphere, actually. I got a photo of the black hole erupting that's only visible in radio wave, but that's one of my newest publications. So just starting off, to give you an idea of what we'll be talking about. So one thing that most people want to know whenever they're starting moon photography, right, or any sort of astrophotography in general, is what do I need? Do I need telescope, camera? Okay, but there's got to be something more than that. So not only will we go into those very basics, but like what is that extra step? What is that something else that you need to go from just having a telescope to taking photos, right? Go into what goes into the moon photo. So now that you have all your equipment, what do you do with it? Like, how do you connect things? What are different pieces good for? Stuff like that. But then, like Andrew hinted at earlier on in the talk, was what are we actually seeing, right? You go out and you look at the moon with your bare eyes, and the what you're seeing with your eyes is not ever exactly like what you see whenever we finish our photos of it, right? So, kind of, what is that difference between what we like to portray in our photos versus what you might actually see with your naked eye, and why those things are different, and kind of the benefits of what we're trying to show. And as you can see right there on the bottom right of the screen, that's actually a geologic map of the moon, and all the different sort of things going on there, from different faults to different rock groups. But then, of course, we'll have more than enough time for questions at the very end of the talk.
So we use a wide variety of telescopes to capture things in our sky. Personally, I use anywhere from 4 to 7 different telescopes on an almost daily basis to capture things. Each one is very purpose built, depending on what I'm trying to do. For example, in these photos Connor has up here, the very leftmost photo and the rightmost photo, you see this big giant thing that has these struts holding together two components of the telescope. That's called a Dobsonian telescope. And I use it mainly for visual use, but I can also do some planetary photography with it. Now, when I'm capturing the moon, Ideally, I want something that's going to stay fixed on the moon and not allowed to drift out of frame, which will happen because the Earth is always moving. So I have what's called a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope on a equatorial mount. That's what you see in that center photo there. That's actually the same telescope I used to take the photo, the Hunt for Artemis, which you'll see some examples of later on this slide. But it's a very long focal length telescope, which allows me to resolve things that have a very small angular size. Now, the moon is actually not small angularly relative to a lot of things in space. It's quite large. However, there's a lot of detailed features on there that I want to be able to resolve, such as mountains and craters. That's why a telescope with a long focal length is required. And as an example here, I'll show you. I have one such telescope right here. This is a smaller version than the one I used for this photo. But the way these work is they have a what's called a corrector plate on the front, holding a small mirror here. There's a large mirror in the back. And that allows the light to go down into the telescope, hit the mirror in the back, hit this secondary mirror in the front, and then go back down the back end of the tube, where it is then captured by a camera. Now, um, I, there's no eyepiece used on these telescopes when I'm using them for photography. It just simply connect a camera right to the back to capture the photo. But you don't need such a large telescope to actually capture photos of space or even the moon. A small one like this would work just fine. This is a 70 millimeter aperture telescope, and you can capture galaxies and nebulas with it. Not as good though for capturing things with a small angular size, though, like planets, or in my case, the intricate details on the moon. But it would be great for capturing the entire
Yeah. So on top of what Andrew was saying about telescopes, so I actually do have the telescope with me right here that we actually used, at least for my portion of the photo. This is the one I use. Sadly, I don't have 7 telescopes like Andrew. Right now, I'm only at 3, which is still honestly too many, depending on who you ask in my family and how many times they're tired of stepping over all my equipment, right? But yeah, so you can take the lid off and kind of get a good little look inside of it at kind of what we have in there in terms of the mirror and the design for it. But I think, Andrew, I think you would probably agree with me on this, that a lot of people, when they're starting off, I almost always recommend a Dobsonian telescope to people starting off, looking to get into either astrophotography, right, or to get into just using a telescope in general, because the Dobsonians, they allow like such a good easy movement and quick setup relative to some of these more complex piers and mounts and stuff for your telescope, that it's really great to just kind of put the telescope down and just point it really quickly wherever you want in the sky. But because they're so large and have such high magnification, you can still get, great photos of, like, over there on the right, you can see Jupiter on your laptop screen. Like, even though they're, more simple, they're still absolutely fantastic for astrophotography or using them visually.
well, I'll disagree a little bit with the
Oh,
astrophotography,
okay.
just because somebody on a budget that wants to get a Dobsonian probably won't go for the tracked option,
Oh,
which
that's
makes
true.
planetary photography very difficult because
Yeah.
the Earth is going to be moving and that planet will drift out of frame. So I would say, really, really, if you want a great visual instrument, get a Dobsonian, and then look at other options for photography,
Yeah.
because it would be tricky to get started with a low end Dobsonian. But some of the track Dobsonians do make for great planetary instruments. And even untracked, you can do it. There's just a much more of a learning curve, which
Yeah.
unfortunately would be very frustrating for a beginner to try to understand how to properly capture the planets when they're also simultaneously drifting through the frame very quickly. Uh, it can make
That's a really good point, because we have such high magnification that, like, even I'm sure you can attest to this, that like even walking by a telescope, whenever you're imaging, you can watch like the image of Jupiter, the moon, or whatever you're photographing. You can watch it shake just from the movement of you walking by, like the subtle vibrations on the ground, right?
Oh yeah, I feel like an elephant because I'll walk by my telescope and I'll see, I'll have Jupiter or Saturn, very close up on the screen because I'm capturing photos, and it'll just do this. It'll just shake all over. I'm like, whoa, I need
Yeah.
to go on a diet or something.
But so moving on, we actually have, the cameras, right? So part of astrophotography is the camera portion. You need something to take the data of what's out in space. You need to take those photons that come hit your telescope, and you need to get them in viewable formats, right? So here's my tried and true method. It's just a classic DSLR. You might use just a classic lens popped on here. It's how most people are used to seeing them, right? But just like you can just, pop this off and put any other lens you want here. Like here's a 35 millimeter Sigma lens. I have a 50 millimeter lens here, or I have, a 600 millimeter lens here. You can take all of those lenses and use them so you can use them just like you would this guy, right? So you just slot your camera right there on the very back of the telescope, just like you would any other lens. They make almost universal adapters to attach these guys. They're known as T ring and T. It's a T ring and T adapters. It's a standardized version of a mounting system to attach cameras to telescopes that we use. It's actually a remnant from back in the day from really old film photography in the early 1900s. Uh, but we still use it today for telescopes. And the reason I actually like a DSLR though and the reason I recommend them is because most people have one, right? If they're looking to get into astrophotography, hopefully they have some idea about photography in general, right? They have that inherent interest in photography, so they have some camera, you know, regardless of the brand, model, etc. Just a very basic DSLR works great. My first DSLR I ever used was actually a Canon T3 that my mom bought because she wanted to take pictures of us, me and my brother growing up, and she just never used it, right? So she ended up letting me borrow it, and that was my first camera. I've moved up the ranks from there, but uh, hopefully, if you don't have a DSLR in your life, at the very least, you can know someone who does have one that would at least let you borrow it to attach to a telescope you might have. But Andrew's going to talk to us about the different types of cameras other than just your classic, DSLRs that are kind of a one and done sort of solution to astrophotography.
Yeah, well, you'll see that on the slide there, you've got a little red camera, and I've got one here in my hands as well. So this is a very, very, very simple camera. If you look very closely in the middle of it, you can actually see the sensor, and it's very small. It's smaller than my fingertip. This is called a planetary camera, and what this does is it takes the most important parts of the camera, which is the sensor and some of the acquisition software that pulls the data off of that sensor, and it gets puts a nice heat sink on the back of the sensor, and then it runs all of that data directly into a laptop PC instead of something like on a DSLR where you have all the onboard software right here within the camera, and then you can view your photo. It doesn't work like that. The goal behind planetary cameras is to take photos as quickly as possible. So it needs that data to just flow right into your laptop. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But when you're doing astrophotography, there's every kind of challenge in the world working against you. You're dealing with things with extreme dynamic range. You're looking through miles of atmosphere, and the atmosphere is incredibly turbulent. Even though you walk outside on a nice clear night and you look up, everything looks nice and clear. When you're at a very high magnification, like 7,000 millimeters of focal length, it's almost like you're looking through pavement on a hot day or you're looking into the bottom of a swimming pool. Everything is wiggling and moving. And you need to be able to somehow get in between those disturbances in the atmosphere to get a nice clear photo. And one of the ways you do that is by capturing thousands upon thousands of photos using a camera specifically designed to do it. And you want to also take very small photos, because if you're capturing a planet, you don't need all the negative space around the planet. You just need the, the planet itself. So you can get a small sensor, which allows you to take photos even faster because those images, those individual images, are so small. Now I can also apply that technique to the moon to create a very high resolution photo of the moon. Now, what if I want to go even deeper than the native focal length of a telescope? I mentioned 7,000 millimeters earlier. The camera or the telescope that I use for planets and moon photography is actually only 2,800 millimeters of focal length. So I use something called a power mate. And it's a variation of a Barlow, where it magnifies the native focal length of a telescope by adding additional optical elements. Where a Barlow uses a single optical element, Barlow uses four optical elements, which allows it not only to magnify, but to keep those light rays parallel as it does so. So you get a really nice crisp image all the way to the corners of your sensor on your camera. Otherwise, you get something called field curvature, which really softens the image. So if you're capturing something that has a larger angular size than a planet, it becomes out of focus in the corners. So the way I capture my moon photography is through one of these little red cameras that I connect to a Barlow, which then connects to my telescope. And then I have everything I need, of course, besides a computer to take my photo.
Yeah, I think Andrew, I think you actually brought up a really good point about how you take like all the good parts of a camera and kind of condense it down into those small red form factors. So like one thing I always mention about DSLRs is that like the best starting camera you can get is basically like the cheapest one you can find or one you already have, right? Because like this is a higher end DSLR, but for astrophotography, like this has so many features in it that I will never use, right? Like it has all these like facial recognition detection, stuff like that, all these sort of fun automatic adjustments that it can do. But for the most part, the sensors between, like your highest end ones and your lowest end ones is not linear, right? Like your most expensive ones are not that are, 10 times more than your cheaper ones are not going to be 10 times better. So those planetary cameras, they're great at just taking everything that we actually want out of here and putting them in a nice small very convenient form factor that's actually way more budget conscious. If someone doesn't have a starting camera, I would always recommend just going directly to a planetary camera, I think, right?
Unless you want to also take photos of people and landscapes.
Exactly, yeah, that is true. They won't be able to, you can't
You
bring that around and take portrait photos,
Yeah,
but
you can use these for other things. You
yeah,
cannot use this for other things.
exactly.
So it's, yeah, it
And that's
really,
why I think most people have one of these already. So I'm like, if you have one, just use it. But if you don't
yeah,
have one and you have no interest in like taking photos of your friends or whatever it may be, just skip it and go right to, our little cameras for planetary stuff.
yeah, yeah. I love my DSLRs, but they're not ideal for planetary photography. You
No,
can
they
get
are
some
not.
good moon photos. They'll just never be as detailed as what you can get with something like this. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
so yeah, it's a solid place to start. You just run into ceilings on what you can actually achieve with them,
Hmm.
if you're trying to go down this astrophotography path.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Andrew, do you want to actually tell them? Because I mean, you have taken way more moon photos than me. Do you want to actually tell them kind of like about like the softwares and like what makes a good night, I guess, for taking photos of the moon?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, I capture my photos based on a number of factors. Sometimes I'm just simply in the mood to take a moon photo, so I just go
Oh
outside
yeah.
and do it. I just don't like really pay attention to conditions or anything. I just go outside and go, I'm going to take a picture of the moon tonight. That being said, I've taken a lot of duds that way.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is be able to assess the conditions. I use special software apps that tell me the upper atmospheric conditions. In astronomy, we call them seeing conditions. And what that does is it tells us how turbulent the upper atmosphere is going to be. And if the upper atmosphere is very turbulent, usually caused by a large temperature differential between the layers of the atmosphere, then unfortunately it'll be very difficult to resolve fine details. Now, you can overcome some of that through some of the processes in the software, but not all of it. Your best conditions will always be a more stable atmosphere, and you can actually tell how stable it is through a couple ways. First of all, you can look up and see if you see plane contrails. If you see plane contrails, that's actually a strong indicator conditions will be bad for astronomy, because now you know that the conditions in the upper atmosphere are colder than conditions in the lower atmosphere. Um, Something a meteorologist once told me that stuck with me, has been very helpful. The other
I've
thing you
never
can
known
look.
that actually, Andrew. That is
Yeah.
brand new information to even me. I That's a huge help actually.
What's interesting is I noticed that anecdotally long before I would go outside, to capture the sun, and I would see contrails everywhere, and my conditions would be terrible. Everything would be all wavy on the
Wow,
screen, and I go, "Oh, this is terrible." And I never connected those dots until a meteorologist told me. But
amazing.
yeah, if you see plane contrails, there's a good chance that conditions will be bad. Now, another key indicator is looking at the stars. So we all know stars twinkle, and of course planets don't, but that's another now planets actually do occasionally twinkle. That's a very bad day for astronomy. So if you do see a planet twinkling, that is a very bad sign. Just pack up your equipment and go inside. But if you see stars twinkling, that's normal, but how much they twinkle will actually tell you the conditions of the atmosphere as well, because what causes that twinkling is the various turbulence in the atmosphere, folding the light before it gets into your eyes, and actually uh, it makes the star essentially invisible for a moment as it passes through these turbulent layers of the atmosphere, which causes it to basically flicker and, in and out. Almost like it's vanishing from the sky for a moment, and it does that, hundreds of times per second. So it just looks like a twinkling action to our eyes. Up close, it actually looks very interesting with a very high magnification telescope. If you can get the exposures down to actually record the twinkling, it looks fascinating up close as you see the light get scattered by this atmosphere in various ways.
Yeah, couldn't
Um,
agree more with you there. Like some of my favorite views through a telescope have been on like super turbulent nights, looking at like Vega or some other super duper bright star or Sirius, right? Where it's just you get a rainbow of colors from the massive amount of twinkling you're getting from the turbulent atmosphere.
Oh yeah, it's incredible because it does scatter light differently based on the
Mhm.
wavelength of light. So you start to see all the colors of that star pop out, and they pop out in very interesting ways. But anyways, we're moving on from that. So unfortunately, it's a very bad thing for planetary and lunar photography, because when you're looking
Yeah.
at the moon up close on a turbulent day, you actually see it come into focus and go out of focus without touching your focus knob on your telescope, and that's the atmosphere softening those layers because it changes the refractive index at from moment to moment, and you end up with very unfortunately unusable images. And that's extreme high magnifications. If you're using a
Mhm.
very simple refractor telescope, a very wide field of view, it's not as important. But I want to get as much detail as possible. I'm shooting at 7,000 millimeters, like the example on the screen here. I'm getting nice and tight up on the moon. So I need it to be as good as possible. And when it is nice and crystal clear, you still have some challenges because you're still looking through atmosphere. It's just not quite as turbulent, but it's still there. So, what you do is you take thousands of photos. You don't take a few photos, you take thousands. That is why these cameras are so necessary. Because if you do that with a DSLR, before you know it, you've actually worn out the life of your DSLR by taking so many photos.
Yeah,
Um,
even like one session of what we do with these moon photographs, like that, 100,000 plus photos, that would erode the DSLR's life by like half at a minimum. Uh, that's why they're great for what they do. Like they're made to take millions and millions of photos over their life.
It The other advantage we have here is the small sensor size.
Yeah.
So as you can see in the example photo, we have a very tight crop of the moon. Now, if I saw the whole moon with with a larger sensor, the same focal length, you'd think that would be better, right?
Mm.
But it's not. The reason for that is you need to be able to look at a small portion of the moon and reject frames that are bad. Now, just because a frame is bad here doesn't mean it would be bad on the other side of the moon. So,
Mhm.
if you're capturing the entire moon at once, you may have one corner of it that's affected by atmosphere, but not the rest of it. You would actually have to discard that entire image. When I capture them up close like this, I do discard images, but it's only one small corner of the moon. So that technique, by the way, is called lucky imaging. So I take thousands and thousands of photos and I discard the ones that look the worst. By
Mhm.
taking the smallest field of view possible, I'm able to preserve more frames than I would if I was capturing the entire moon. And then I take those thousands of photos that I captured up these close sections and I stack together the best ones, and that does a lot for me for improving the signal to noise ratio of that image. It also, of course, allows me to sharpen it. So I end up with this very noise-free, very crystal clear image by taking those thousands of photos and running them through special software. I use a technique called deconvolution to resolve some details. I think we'll get into that later. I might be getting ahead of myself.
Nah.
Um, but uh, but that's only possible because I'm taking so many photos. If I take a single snapshot with a DSLR, it will be it'll look out of focus
Mhm.
and it will look noisy.
Yeah.
And there's not really a way around that. I have friends that take all these photos with their DSLRs, and they're like, Andrew, I don't understand. Like, why are my photos not as good as yours? And I say, sorry, you need the right tools for the job, and you need the right technique for the job.
Yeah.
And that technique is lucky imaging using a very small field of view. And frankly, a DSLR is not cut out for it.
Yeah.
In addition to the DSLR not being cut out for it because of the size of the sensor, it also has mechanical elements that introduce fine motion into the
Mhm.
image, where this type of camera does not. I noticed a while that my images were actually even blurrier than they should have been because there was a mechanical action of the shutter opening and closing, which actually caused the entire telescope to shake.
Yeah, that's like so whenever you take a photo of a DS with a DSLR, most people are they know that like that famous noise that it makes. And what you're actually having happen is so there's a little mirror in here, right? And that mirror flips up and allows the light to hit the sensor, but then that mirror closes back down, and that's what's making that classic click noise. Uh, but that motion, if you're, trying to take thousands of photos, like you're just sitting there shaking that camera back and forth essentially. And when you have such small changes, uh, they get magnified at these really high magnifications. And actually, Andrew, you mentioned that shooting the whole moon is not good, right? One caveat there, as someone who is intrinsically lazy when it comes to their photography at times, that's the only time I actually really enjoy shooting the as much of the moon as possible. Because, like you said, how much time do you think you have to spend making out a giant mosaic of your thousands and thousands of really close up shots, right?
Oh, it's a long time. It depends on the focal
Exactly.
length I do. Yeah, it's funny. A lot of people say, taking a photo of the moon is easy, and I say, well, yeah, like
Mm,
taking a quick photo of the moon, yeah, is
yeah,
easy. But I'm not taking quick photos of the moon. I'm taking detailed maps of the surface and the craters and the mountains.
exactly.
That that takes time. I would say it's a minimum of 30 to 45 minutes of
Yeah.
just taking photos.
Wow. See, and that
And
so for the record, Andrew's much faster at it than me. Like I'm at 30 to 45 minutes, maybe if I'm shooting like uh 10 different panels of the moon rather than like 100 different mosaic panels. He's very quick at it.
I've more experience than you with
Yeah.
the moon, just
With
with
the
the
moon, I can take
moon.
it.
And yeah, but that's just on the acquisition side. Once I take all the photos, they all have to be stacked together. They
Mm,
like a lot of the process is automated. I upload them in batches of like 1,000 to 2,000 into special software that automatically aligns, sorts, and stacks the photos. But then I have to piece them together manually. I just do it in Photoshop, where I take each tile and kind of overlay them and make sure the features line up before I blend them all together, which takes a lot of time to do right because you get uneven panels. The transparency of the atmosphere is actually constantly changing. You can't really see it visually, but you get like a little bit of precipitate, or something just in between you and the miles of atmosphere and the moon. and it slightly changes how much of that light's getting to you. So you go to assemble this thing, and none of the panels match up. You're like, why is this one darker than this one? And that'll look terrible if you stitch them together. So you have to match the brightness of each one. So yeah, it can be quite complicated. I actually, with a very big moon project, sometimes it takes me weeks or even months to get a good satisfactory result because of those types of differences, which become exaggerated the more detailed the photo gets because you have such
Mhm.
a smaller field of view and use more panels to create the final image.
Yeah, and I think this is some screenshots of our Hunt for Artemis image, right? So you have like I did the color data for the image, and Andrew did essentially the detail portion of it, because shooting color and detail at the same time can get a little convoluted. And both of us had great views that night of the moon, so we took one at the same time and we kind of split up the load work. But you can really see how much of a difference, my 50,000 versus his 200,000, how much it cleared it up over on the left. But if you look in the top right, you can see, a single frame versus, the finished image, what goes from like a very blurry, very noisy image of a crater after you get rid of, all the really bad atmospheric disturbance and all the noise, you end up seeing way more detail on the crater than what was ever there on, your single photos.
Are you sharing that image, Connor?
I
I
believe
don't see
so.
it.
Uh, what is showing up on my screen right now?
I don't see it. You did a great
Oh,
job describing it, but
okay, cool. Well, you know the slide I'm referring
yeah,
to,
there you
right?
go. There you go.
So
All
yeah,
right.
and
Yeah,
then
I
you
just
actually
I want to make
on
sure
the
people can see it because this stuff is pretty cool. All right.
yeah,
It's
absolutely. And on the right, you can actually see. So this software, all those squares you're seeing are actually alignment points it's using, looking at features on the moon, to make sure that it lines up all these frames perfectly, and you can actually see a quality graph. So luckily, this isn't something Andrew and I have to sit there and go through hundreds of thousands of frames manually. Uh, this software can actually look at it and do some calculations and know just how turbulent the atmosphere was at that nanosecond the photo was taken, right? And then it can, yeah, you see the frame percentage to stack, right? So you can do like 75% if you want to keep a lot of them because you have a really good night, or you could get rid of most of them and only keep like 5%. But at the end of the day, generally the more frames you have, the better your photo is going to end up being. But the thing is with these photos, like, what are we seeing, right? So most people, they've seen the moon. They walk outside, they look up in the sky, and there it is. And this is kind of what you're used to seeing. You see a bright, ball in the sky. It's white. It's got some stars around it. Maybe. Or maybe it looks like this if you're super unlucky. This is actually a photo of the eclipse in 2015. I was quite upset that I was clouded over, but this is run of the mill stuff with astrophotography, right? But even if you've had the pleasure of looking at these things through a telescope, something like this might be what you're used to seeing. A mostly colorless image of the moon. You can still see all the craters and stuff. But that leads me to so why do our photos look like this, right? And the thing with uh, science as well as just kind of I think what Andrew and I like to do is what I would say is almost kind of an outreach for the sciences. Andrew, wouldn't you say?
yeah, my goal is just get as many people excited about space as I am. So
Absolutely.
I think one of the key ways of doing that is show people beautiful images.
Hmm.
Um, Say,
Yeah.
look at what's this. This is our moon. This is our moon. This is actually our moon. It looks in this photo like, and this is the first time I think the complete photo has popped up on the slide here. So, maybe first time for some of the viewers to see it. But this is the final product of our collaboration. A
Yeah.
combination of 250,000 photos with where you can actually see the real color of the moon, something that your eyes actually can't see, and our eyes are of course limited. The
Yeah.
camera and the cameras are less limited.
Yeah, and
um,
that's the thing. So like the cameras, like they're amazing tools, right? And they can do so much more that our eyes can't. But the thing is like when we look up in the sky, and we see half of the moon, right? We know there's another portion of the moon there. Our eyes just can't see it because it's too dark, right? There's no sunlight, or there is some sunlight because we can see it in the photos, but there isn't enough for our eyes to actually see it, right? Kind of like these color differences. Like all these color differences are really there, and they actually tell quite a story that I'll get into in a bit. Uh, but like our eyes are limited. They're not. perfect tools for a job. Like if we, and the science has relied solely on our eyes for, scientific advancement, we lose out on, you know, almost every discovery made in the 20th century, right? Which we shouldn't limit ourselves to just what our eye can see, but also at the same time, I think this gives a more accurate, representation of like what the moon actually is, right, versus what our eyes can see. Because the moon is a full sphere. It does have these real subtle color differences on it, and just because we can't see it doesn't mean, the way I look at it is they shouldn't be portrayed, right?
I'm sorry, what was your question?
Sorry, I was saying that, like, I think these kind of photos that we've made of the moon are better representations of the moon, because like what we see with our eyes are, what we're limited to. But we know the moon is a full sphere, not just like a half
Right.
slice cut in half,
Yep.
right? We know that there are these, different geologic conditions on the moon, even if we can't see them with our eyes. Like we know they're there. Uh, and highlighting things like that, I think, is really important for giving a more complete photo of the moon, relative to what we're actually capable of looking up in the sky and seeing.
I try to remind people that our eyes are actually a pretty poor instrument for
Yeah.
measuring reality. We measure a very limited slice of reality with our
Mhm.
eyes. And it's very important, but it does not tell a complete picture.
Yeah.
Our moon has all kinds of variation to landscape that your eyes cannot detect. And to your point, Connor, you can't see the dark side of the moon most of the time.
Yeah.
And because something is in shadow, we all understand object permanence. It's like not
Exactly.
like the game of peekaboo your parents played with you when you were a baby. We know when something disappears, it doesn't mean it's gone.
Hmm.
It just means our eyes no longer detect it. So how do we incorporate these things into photos, so that we can show what is really there, even though your eyes can't see it? Much of my work is about showing people beyond the limits of your eyeballs, to show you
Yeah.
all the beautiful things that are out there that you might be missing.
Hmm. And one of my favorite examples is actually that I use all the time is like, say I have a blue blanket, right, and it's on my bed, but I go into my room and I shut the lights off. Like, not only is that blanket still there, it's not, black, it's not nothing, but it's still blue, even if my eyes aren't capable of currently seeing it. And it's not just us that do this, right? Like, this is a photo from the Galileo missions, from NASA in 1996, and this is, the photo that Galileo took of the moon. But then it also took this, right? And what we're seeing here is that infrared data, things that our eyes can't see. What this actually is showing us is the atomic bonds between different elements on the lunar surface, right? So you might have a carbon and a hydrogen bonding, and we have very specific emissions of that wavelength that are known. Or, maybe it's a sulfur, or maybe it's, some carbaceous mineral, or it's just some variation of basalt. Like, there's way more variation on the actual surface of the moon. Like, it looks for the most part homogeneous when we look at it, but geologically speaking, the composition of what rocks actually make up the moon, couldn't be more different. But we do see, like, so here's an example of, there we go. So this is an example actually of what it kind of looks like when you're looking through the telescope at the moon. And we can see a lot of that wavy, kind of under the water effect that Andrew was referring to earlier. You can see it kind of going in and out of focus. But one of the big things about the moon, right, is we have such a drastic change in dynamic range. This was also something Andrew mentioned earlier. When the sky is basically pitch black, the moon is very, very bright. And seeing those subtle differences on the actual lunar surface is really tough, especially from a color perspective. Uh, and but just because those differences aren't there, uh, with our eyes, doesn't mean they're not actually there and visible to more precise instruments like our cameras. So here we have two squares, one that looks whitish and one that looks grayish. But if we increase the saturation on these images, we can actually see they are yellow and blue, two drastically different colors. And this is actually a great example. This is from the Apollo missions. Harrison Schmitt, one of the only geologists to actually ever get sent to the moon. And as a geologist, I've always loved that. But here we have a photo he took of, he's on the radio and he's, exclaiming, there's orange soil here. And you look at that, and it's not really orange, but this is all to do with, film development, right? So once he was back on Earth, he actually talked to the people who developed this photo, and they recreated it. And this is more like what he was actually seeing. So even, people like NASA, when they're trying to make their photos look just like what the person was actually seeing, they can get it wrong, right? So here's actually another great example. So this is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It's a satellite that orbits the moon and takes photos. Like, this is purely in the visible spectra, but as you can see, there's a lot of oranges, browns, and blues, very bright whites, and very dark regions of the moon. These are all different mineralogical compositions. These are all variations that, with the moon being so far away and so bright, they're just very tough to see from here on Earth. But, all these things are really there. You just need to have better equipment than just our, silly little eyes to spot these differences. But with that said, I of course want to thank you all very much for your time. I know it's quite late over there in Moscow. Just so happy that you all could join us, especially a lot of our American viewers as well. It's been a pleasure, and I can't wait to hear some questions from y'all. Andrew, any closing thoughts?
No, just wanted to say thank you to the American Center in Moscow, and yeah, thanks for letting us ramble. We hope that we've inspired some of you maybe to look at the moon maybe a little bit differently, and maybe even some of you to pick up a camera and I try to take some photos. We're I think both Connor and I are very accessible when it comes to answering questions, not only of course in the chat, but even finding us on social media and reaching out to us. I think he had our handles up there for like just a second. I think those
Oh
are
yeah,
our
sorry.
Instagram handles. We love talking to people, and no worries. I know like this is getting translated and into Russian, so we can use translators and answer questions ourselves too. So it's like, don't
Yeah,
worry about the language barrier. We are happy to chat with anybody who wants to get into this. I
of
think
course.
space is one of the things that unites us.
And I think, Andrew, you're right with me. Like, if I get a message on Instagram, I'm almost always responding to it. I hate the idea of unread emails. I'm one of those people that always reads every email that I get, just to make that number go down. But at the same time, I'm always just so excited to help anyone looking to get into space. But I'll actually do the first question for you, Andrew. So this is what initially sparked your interest in astrophotography, and was there a specific space photo you saw when you were younger that inspired you to try it yourself?
Well, what first sparked my interest in astrophotography was actually way back, going back to when I was a little kid. I think I was like 8 years old, and my dad showed me Jupiter and Saturn through his telescope. And seeing those as a kid, sparked all kinds of curiosity. Probably had no real good frame of reference what I was looking at, but that turned me, probably turned me into a Star Trek junkie. I was like
Mm,
watching Star Trek and just like loved it. Watched Star Wars, loved it. It was like all of my Legos were like space based. So it was very much like, I was just kind of in that trajectory ever since I was a little
mhm.
kid. And then when I was an adult, I bought a telescope on a whim to try to recreate that experience for me. And of course, try to take a photo using my cell phone through the
Oh yeah.
eyepiece. Didn't turn out too well, but that was what got me on this trajectory of astrophotography. And that was only that happened about 6 years ago. I mean, 5, 6 years ago. So it wasn't that long ago,
Mhm.
relatively speaking. And then now this is where I am and what I'm doing. So, I think that trajectory could apply to almost anybody.
Yeah, and actually, I'm not too far different from you. So, like, for me, what sparked my initial interest in space was like seeing those images from Hubble of like the pillars of creation, or like the Helix Nebula, right? Like, those are two like of my favorite all-time photos. And I saw those, when I was a kid. Like, they'd always get tossed around in like the email chains and stuff like that. Uh, but then a step beyond that, I was in college, and that was when I found out that not only are, like NASA and Hubble capable of this, but like we civilians essentially are capable of this. And I took my brother's telescope, who, he had gotten one when he was a kid and he had never touched it since. I plopped it down and pointed at the first bright thing I saw in the sky. And it just happened to be Jupiter. And I nailed it when I looked through the eyepiece, which, knowing today, like, how many times have you randomly pointed at something in the sky, Andrew, and gotten it like right there when you look? Because I almost miss the moon sometimes, and that's huge. If I knew how lucky I was, more than likely, I think that was an act of faith right there.
Yeah.
But of course, I did the same thing. I'm sitting there holding, my camera up to the eyepiece, trying to get it in focus, and I was like, "There's got to be a better way than this. No one uses a cell phone for this." And that's what brought me into the hooking up cameras to actual telescopes.
Yeah, it sounds like both of our stories are a little serendipitous.
Yeah.
If Jupiter wasn't out that night, would we both be on the careers that we have and have gotten into astrophotography? Who knows?
Honestly, probably not. Like, actually, yeah. Now that I think about it, imagine if we didn't have many other planets in the solar system to like actively view. If there would still even be that interest. But Andrew, we talk things like this all the time, right? We're always going off on tangents. But
Oh yeah.
next question: what advice would you give to photographers eager to capture detailed lunar images but might not have advanced equipment?
Phones are getting very advanced these days. Start with your phone. It's like, yeah, your photos aren't going to be as good as mine, but that's okay. You're dealing with limited technology. And then, a small like desktop Dobsonian, they're
Mhm.
actually pretty cheap. I think you can get one for like 50, $60.
Yeah.
That's USD. But you can take those, point them at the moon, put your camera on the against the eyepiece, and actually take a decent moon photo. And there's a lot of people I know that do just that.
Yeah.
And they actually capture really cool photos, and they do different things with layering and compositing. Take photos of the moon against the clouds and like the stars.
Mhm.
So if you combine, some good like curiosity with some diligence and a little bit of work with learning the software and learning how to control the exposures on your camera, you can actually get some really, really nice photos. Don't
Yeah.
expect it to compete with mine, but we're not in competition with each other. Just
Yeah.
so long as you like it, that's the important thing.
It's actually funny. When I first met Andrew, uh, I early on when I was doing astrophotography, it was always a strive to like I need to make my images better than X person's. But after actually talking to people within the community, that went right out the window, right? Like I ended up like I realized just how much more fun it is to collaborate with other people, right? It's not a competition, and that's one thing I always try to stress to people looking into astrophotography. Like you see a lot of our finished works. Like I've been doing this for almost 10 years now. Andrew's been doing this for nearly the same amount of time. Like our first photos, I wish I would have included one. My first photo is like a 7 pixel wide image of Saturn, and you can barely even make out the rings. It looks like an oval. Like we all start somewhere, and honestly, people that start today are gonna have way better results than we even did too, because at least they have their nicer cell phones. Because when I recommend to people deep space photography stuff a lot, right? I'm sure you get all the beginning moon questions, but I get all the beginning, nebulas and galaxy questions. I always just recommended people just get a cheap DSLR, throw it on top of a rock, and just let the camera roll, right? But even nowadays, like I was like, oh, that's the entry level. But nowadays, I'm even a step further back than that. I'm like, you have a cell phone and they have night modes on them. Like, start off with that. But my next question for you, Andrew, did you expect our photo of the moon to be this well received?
I didn't. I think one nice thing about this photo, the hunt for Artemis, was that it told a very nice story
Yeah.
about two complementary minds coming together to create something incredible. It's like I've taken obviously tons of photos of the moon. Some of them are very popular, and some of them just aren't. And I don't think that's necessarily quite like a testament to the quality of the photo so much
Yeah.
as how well the story resonates with people. And I think one of the interesting things about the hunt for Artemis is because of our story, because it was two different minds coming together. One, I think you're a little bit more scientifically minded, Connor, and I think I might be more artistically minded.
Mhm.
Because of that, the nature of that collaboration, we were able to show people the moon in a new way. And either of us could have done that alone as well. I think you're just as artistic as I am, honestly, if not more
Yeah,
so. But
I
uh,
disagree. I think you're far better at me. The things you
uh,
have pulled off, I'm like, Andrew has such a creative mind uh that like I can like peek outside of the box. Dude, you're over there living in your own box completely separate from me. You've left the box and built your own. It blows me away just how creative you can be at times.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm in the garbage bag next to the box.
but I'm kind of the same about like about it being well received. I some of my favorite images, I'm sure you can attest to this too. Like some of my personal favorite images, no one cares about.
Yeah.
But some of the ones where I'm like, it's a okay photo. Like maybe some people like it. Like some people go crazy for those. I'm like, I have no idea sometimes what people are after. But this one, I did really like the fact that my favorite part of it is getting people excited about space, right?
Mhm.
And it's great to have this collaboration of showing that not only is it possible to kind of do this, but like there's a whole community of us that do this essentially, right? But I'll let you take this next question.
All right, so let me think. It was, in your opinion, how important is post-processing in astrophotography? What photo editing programs do you use to produce the best image possible?
So yeah, I think it's half the battle is what I would say. That's generally how I describe it. Personally, for me, since I am more uh, galaxy and nebula deep space oriented, I use software called PixInsight. It's my favorite. Pretty much everything I do is through that, and actually, a lot of the scientific photos I've created, I've used that same exact software because it's a very mathematical and scientific software like background. So a lot like you can't just paint in things. Like I get a lot of questions about that. Like, oh, are you just painting in things? You're just painting in colors? It's like no, like all these things are really there in the data, and that software is almost frustratingly limiting sometimes in terms of like what it'll actually allow you to do. But on the back end, from like a how scientifically sound something is, I can always like look back and see what kind of formulas I'm running and whatnot. But that's what I use. And what do you use?
I use the same thing, but I use Photoshop as well. Not to like people associate Photoshop with like
Yeah,
artificial images now, which is
exactly.
I think very bad because it's the most powerful photographer's tool.
Exactly.
And one thing about post processing, I think that people forget is your phone actually
Mhm.
does all kinds of process to your images. They're just
Yeah.
pre-baked. They're just a pre-formula color balancing, sharpening, noise reduction. It goes through all of these steps
Yeah.
right when you take a photo, and then you see the final photo, and you're like, oh, yeah, that looks good. If we did something similar to that, or the photo would look bad because
Oh yeah.
a pre-baked setting like that is not going to apply very well when you're shooting something that's so faint it's basically invisible. So
Mhm.
we need to be very mathematical and very accurate with how we process the images. So in many ways, our photos, well, yes, they're post-processed, they're much more accurate than what
Yeah.
you would take with a cell phone. And the post processing isn't really editing as much as it is like developing the photos,
Developing. That's a really good way to
like in
point
a
it.
digital darkroom.
Mhm.
And when you change that mindset, it helps you, I think, understand where these photos come from. Because these cameras actually they don't do any kind of processing. It just sends the raw data
Yeah.
directly into your computer. So it has to be post processed. The raw
And
data doesn't look good.
I think what's important is that, you and I both, we're never trying to make, like really artificial scenes or like add things that aren't there, right? Like we're not adding, Saturn's rings to the moon, really. Like, I mean, if we do, we would clearly state, hey, these are Saturn's rings on the moon, right?
Yeah.
But like we do our best to kind of portray the scene as best as we can and accurately at that, right? Well, also still, taking some artistic liberties just to make it visually appealing, because it is part of it is getting people excited about space, and that's a whole thing. But the actual act is, I think you and I both have at least you know a huge portion of scientific like integrity behind our images, right? Like I couldn't imagine like faking photos or whatever. Like that would kill me personally. But do you have
Yeah.
any memorable experiences or adventures you've had while capturing astrophotography?
You know, I think I would say that my most memorable experiences are always the celestial events that I'm capturing. So it's not like, anything random happens. It's not like I'm a wedding photographer or something
Yeah.
like that, where it's like there's this human element of
Mm,
surprise where, oh no, the bride ran out.
yeah.
It's like nothing like that I think would happen
Yeah.
that's not really predictable, with some caveats to that. But um, I, I would say the weather is the only thing that's like a little bit variable.
Mm, yeah.
I think one of the nicest pleasant surprises I've had is when I'm shooting a celestial event, such as a lunar eclipse
Mhm.
or maybe a Martian occult of the moon, and the clouds roll in.
Oh,
not to obscure, but to
but the highlight.
frame the image.
Yeah.
And then I end up with a photo with a little bit of earthly drama around it that
Yeah.
was not planned, that ends up adding, I think, a little bit more character to my image, but also makes it completely unique than any other photo capture of the exact celestial event because nobody had the clouds in exactly the same way I did.
Yeah.
So I think little surprises like that are what I love seeing as a astrophotographer. Even though I hate clouds, when they come in just right,
Oh yeah.
sometimes it improves the image.
See, and I think for me, like the biggest, like I always tell people that astrophotography is like you have one model and you get 100 photographers lined up to take a photo of that exact model with the same lighting and everything else because we're all taking photos of the same thing. It's like, how do you make your photo different from like those hundreds of other photographers, right? Like there is some technique in it, but there's also the processing. So things like the clouds are great, but for me, my most memorable events are always when I bring other people with me, right? So my favorite is so I'm a geologist, so I did what's called field camp, which is essentially me and a bunch of other geologists in college. We get shipped off to the middle of nowhere and go wander around and look at rocks for a couple months. We had one night off a week, and I had 5 friends with me who had never seen the Milky Way before. And on our one night off, there was no moon and it was clear, which is like one night out of the week. Like that was a great kind of alignment of the stars, pun intended. Uh, but we all went out there and I got to show 5 people the Milky Way that had never seen the Milky Way, right? I got to show them the different parts of it, and they had seen the sky as they never had before. Uh, and to this day, they mention like going out and seeing it again, or the times they've gone out and done stargazing on their own. Like they had never done that before, but because they had such a great experience, like I've influenced them to the point where they go out and do it on their own now. And for me, I love that because that's a lasting impact.
That's great. Inspiring people. It's just like
It's the
what
best.
better purpose? What better purpose than that?
Yeah.
You know?
I think we got one more here. So, astrophotography requires patience and dedication. How do you maintain your enthusiasm and commitment over long hours of capturing and processing images? That's a good one.
I like to tell people, frequently that I am actually not special in any way whatsoever. They say, "Oh, you must take talent to do this." So that is actually not true. You don't need talent to do, I think, most of anything.
Yeah.
What you need is to love it enough to get through it when it's hard.
Hmm.
You ask a musician, they didn't pick up the guitar and like learn to play it instantly and were good
Yeah.
at it. No, they just loved it enough to play it long enough while they were terrible at it, to where they suddenly
Yeah.
started becoming good. So I think the reason I have enthusiasm over this is because I love it enough to be enthusiastic, even though it's difficult.
Yeah.
If you don't love it enough, then you probably will not be as successful because you won't have this level of enthusiasm doing something that's repetitive and difficult and oftentimes not very rewarding.
Yeah.
Um, However, when the payoff is good, it's worth it. So I urge anybody to try to stick with it as long as they can, even when it's very frustrating. The amount
Yeah.
of times I've cursed at my telescopes, we won't get
Too
into it,
many.
but
Yeah.
too many times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right there with you. Like the amount of times I've stayed up all night and I check my phone and it says like 5:35 a.m. and my alarm is slated to go off in 25 minutes. And I look at my laptop and there's 0 photos to show for the entire night of like troubleshooting. Like those don't really translate into our final photos, right? But those all exist. I'm sure like, learning guitar or whatever, there's, hours where they spend like trying to learn riffs or whatever, but it's that dedication and passion that, even though I was up all night doing that, uh, like that is kind of the love for astronomy that just drives me. It's like, okay, well, tonight was rough, but it'll get better. Like there's always bad nights, right? It's just like anything else. And honestly, even when I am frustrated, at least I still had a good time, looking at the stars or whatever it may be. But just some like final thoughts. I mean, I hope like even if no one goes out and does astrophotography after hearing us talk about it, right? Like I don't expect, everyone watching this to go out and buy a telescope and camera and set it up. But for me, like I think just small victories are just like if someone goes out and just looks at the stars one more time.
Mhm,
For me, that's a win. That's all I ever ask for.
mhm. Yeah, take a moment and just appreciate our place in the universe, and spend some time looking for the moon. As it rises when it's full. Just take a moment and just appreciate. Everybody's looking at that same moon. It's one of the few things that I think we all have in common is we all share the same sky. So look, like I love space. I hope you love
Yeah,
it too. Some people are made to be capturing photos, and some people are meant to just be looking at those photos. So it's okay if it's not for everybody.
yeah,
But our sky is for everybody, and
that's
just
very
the
true.
way you appreciate is a very personal thing to you. So go appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you
Thank
to
you,
our
Connor.